Okay, gentrification. This is perhaps maybe the most hot button of the lectures this semester. So first of all, so what we're going to do in this lecture, we're going to of course define gentrification, like just make sure that we all know what we're talking about. We're going to look at the effects, and then we're going to look at the causes. So essentially, gentrification is when a neighborhood receives an influx of higher socioeconomic status households. So you take typically, a poor neighborhood, just in the most general terms, when a poor neighborhood gets a bunch of middle to upper income households moving into it. All right, now, the general process, things change over time. Cities evolve, cities change, all right? And, this can be especially pronounced with gentrification. When you have, the stereotype is you have, high income individuals moving into a neighborhood. They like different types of amenities than the lower income, or rather they can afford different types of amenities than the existing lower income individuals. And so the neighborhood changes. We get our fancy coffee shops, we get our fancy stores, fancy craft brew places that cater to these new residents. Okay. And then of course, oftentimes the dwellings themselves will change. The high income individuals will, remodel their houses, or there'll be apartment complexes, new apartment complex that cater to these residents. Okay, so we have an influx of high socioeconomic status households, and this typically will change the character of the neighborhood. So, all right, and so this has happened. So what's interesting is, if you go to like London, or even say, New York, or even Los Angeles, there are a lot of neighborhoods that don't change over time, over hundreds of years. So there was this, there was a study recently that showed where there were cholera outbreaks in London, those are still the poor neighborhoods today. In LA, Beverly Hills has always been Beverly Hills. In New York, the Upper East Side has always been the wealthy neighborhood. And so there's a lot of stasis. But what we've seen in the past 25 years or so is there's actually also been a lot of change. That neighborhoods have transitioned from being low-income neighborhoods to middle to high-income neighborhoods. In Los Angeles, you think of Silver Lake. When I was going to school in LA, like Silver Lake was a rough neighborhood. Now, Silver Lake is home to like celebrities. Like many of like young celebrities live in Silver Lake, and it's a very, nice neighborhood in the present. That is gentrification. All right, that Silver Lake gentrified over the past 20 years or so. And I think a lot of essentially what has happened is these are neighborhoods that were initially nicer neighborhoods. As cities emptied out in the 20th century, they became low-income neighborhoods, and now they're returning to being middle to high-income neighborhoods. Okay, so what is this? All right, so let's look at some data. So this is the share of downtown tracts with a 2 quartile increase in its socioeconomic index since 1960. So essentially, these are neighborhoods that gentrified. And so we can see not a lot of change from 1970 to 1980, a little bit of change from 1980 to 1990. And then we have this huge increase from 1990 to 2010. This would just increase into 2020, where roughly probably over 10% of our downtown tracts have undergone gentrification in the past 30 years. Okay. This is home prices near the central business district. And so what we can see is starting in 1980, it's actually home prices are more expensive in the suburbs. So this line right here is 1980. That changes a little in 1990, a little more in 2000, and then in 2010, we have gone back to the typical monocentric city pattern where the neighborhoods nearest to the central business district are actually the most expensive neighborhoods. Okay. There's a population growth rate. Again, you can see in the most recent periods that we have good data for, the neighborhoods that are growing the most are these downtown neighborhoods. Typically, or stereotypically, gentrification is associated with white people, and we can see this influx of white people to the center neighborhood in the most recent period. College graduates, again, are associated with gentrification, and we again see that influx of college graduates going to those center city districts. Here we have LA, and we can kind of get a feel for the neighborhoods that have classified as gentrified. And so the red will be gentrified in both decades. And then the other colors were, either in the 1990 to 2000 period or the more recent period. And so we can see a lot of LA's downtown and east side making that transition. All right. So to be specific, we have high socioeconomic status individuals or households moving into a neighborhood. Theoretically, this should increase the home and rental prices. So, your classic supply and demand. This is basically an income shock to the neighborhood, that now this neighborhood has more high-income individuals. That shifts the demand curve out for both housing and rentals. So if we have a standard supply and demand framework, prices should increase. In economic terms, when people are talking about the downsides of gentrification, they are typically referring to displacement. So theoretically, what would happen is the prices increase. The existing residents can no longer afford the rent. So for homeowners, if you're an existing resident, you're a homeowner, you're fine. Your house just doubles in value, basically, and now your wealth has increased drastically. So typically what people worry about is the renters. So your existing residents, the rental prices go up, they can no longer afford the rent, and they are forced to leave the neighborhood. So the negative view of gentrification from an economic standpoint is this displacement. Now, there are other cultural concerns that some sort of culture is lost in this process of gentrification. We are not going to address that in this lecture. This will strictly focus on the economic effects, and the negative economic effect as posited in popular perception is displacement, is the fact that gentrification drives the existing residents out. That is what we'll be focusing on when we're looking at the effects of gentrification. So as these neighborhoods have gentrified, we can see this in the Google Ngram data. So this is just pulled from books. And so we can see this increased prevalence of the term gentrification, which is something that people have become concerned about. In popular perception, it has a negative connotation generally. So this is kind of what it looks like. Here we have the older dwellings, and then we have the new dwelling going in, ostensibly catering to the new high net worth households. Here we have an example from San Francisco, existing neighborhood. We get the new apartment complex. Another San Francisco example, empty lot being replaced by this complex. Again, associated with gentrification are these like fancy coffee shops. Here's a sign from one coffee shop. They got in a lot of trouble for this sign. Okay, here we have another just thing I pulled from social media, making fun of these sort of fancy coffee shops that tend to come with gentrification. Here we have, again, more negative connotation, people, arguing against gentrification. Again, here are more stuff I pulled from using this particular just searching this hashtag on Instagram. This is what is shown up. And so gentrification has this negative connotation out there. Some of this is cultural, but a lot of it is economic, this idea that it drives the existing residents out. that drives the existing residents, the long-term residents, out of the neighborhood. Now, this is not a theoretical question. This is an empirical question, meaning this is not something that necessarily, we could debate. We can look at the actual data. We can go and look at these neighborhoods and find out exactly what happens in these neighborhoods. Now, you can quibble with the methodology of these papers, but theoretically, this is an empirical question. And the empirical question is gentrification driving low-income residents out? Is it the case that a gentrifying neighborhood would have more exodus of low-income individuals than a similar neighborhood that is not gentrifying, that doesn't have the influx of middle to high-income residents? And so there is plenty of papers looking at this. And so let's look at, I picked some here, but you can, there's more. You can look at essentially the bibliography of these papers, or sorry, the works cited for these papers, or you can look at papers that cite these papers. And you could find, plenty of economics literature looking at the economic effects of gentrification to try to identify the extent of displacement. Now, what these papers will find is essentially this is a myth, that empirically there's virtually no evidence for displacement. What does that mean? Does that mean that nobody gets displaced? No. Anecdotally, some people will not be able to afford the rent increases. And also, it should be noted, it's not, many old buildings do not have the high level of rent increases that a newer building would have. But what this means is when these papers go and look, on average, they do not find more displacement in gentrifying neighborhoods than similarly non-gentrifying neighborhoods. Essentially, the movement out of existing residents move out of neighborhoods at similar rates when we compare gentrifying and non-gentrifying neighborhoods. Okay, so one of the first papers to look at this, well, the first paper to look at this is a Vigdor paper, but this is looking at New York in the 1990s. And again, what their strategy is, they're going to take gentrifying neighborhoods and non-gentrifying neighborhoods, and they're going to look at the mobility rates of low-income households. And they're going to see, is it the case that low-income households move more in gentrifying neighborhoods than in non-gentrifying neighborhoods? And the answer is no. So here are their gentrifying neighborhoods. And they do not find any evidence that the mobility rates are higher for these low-income households in the gentrifying neighborhoods. In fact, they find the reverse. And this is similar to what Vigdor found in Boston. So that was New York City. Freeman follows it up by looking at the entire US. And he also tries to get a better control group. So you can imagine, like, what we're doing here is we're trying to do like a natural experiment, all right? And the treatment is gentrification. So we have a control group, which would be our neighborhoods that are all similar. We'd like to make these neighborhoods as similar as possible. So imagine take like all the low-income neighborhoods, and we're going to treat some of them with gentrification. Some of them are going to have an influx of high socioeconomic status households. And what we'll look at is, does the mobility rates differ between these neighborhoods? All right, so Freeman basically does this. He tries to make a comparable sample. He basically tries to make his experimental group made up of similar neighborhoods. Does this for the entire US. And again, this time he finds a little evidence of displacement, but it's a tiny effect, 0.5% higher, more likelihood of moving in a gentrifying neighborhood than a non-gentrifying neighborhood. All right, less than a 1% increase in the probability that they move. All right, and he also views this as an upper bound, not a lower bound. We have another paper, more recent paper, that uses better data. So typically, as we progress, we're going to get better and better data. This paper looks at Philadelphia in 2002 to 2014, when the downtown Philadelphia, was rapidly gentrifying. And essentially, they get access to credit data, like credit scores of people, so they'll be able to see what people's credit scores are and their addresses. And so they classify these neighborhoods, red neighborhoods, as gentrification, and then the blue neighborhoods as I mean, basically just different levels of gentrification. And what they find is, okay, they do find that residents in gentrifying neighborhoods are more likely to move, but this is driven by the high net worth existing residents. So this is not the low net worth residents getting pushed out. Rather, it's the high net worth residents saying, okay, my neighborhood's getting more expensive. I'm just going to go live in a different neighborhood now. And they don't find any evidence of the low credit score, the low net worth households moving at higher rates. However, those that do move in gentrifying neighborhoods move to worse neighborhoods. Right? Presumably, the neighborhoods that are left open to them are now much worse, as many neighborhoods have gentrified. But there is no difference in the mobility rates of the low credit score households between gentrifying and non-gentrifying households. Okay. We have more studies looking at more detailed census data. And again, there is no evidence of displacement. Okay. And actually there is evidence that the original residents report that they've made a lot more. So what happens is maybe your rent goes up, but also your income goes up as well when your neighborhood gentrifies. And the original residents report they are actually more satisfied with the neighborhood as it's gentrified. Final paper that I pulled, this is very, very recent, came out just at the end of last year. Again, this finds no evidence of displacement or minimal evidence of displacement. And this paper is actually able to look at the original residents' children. So they find the original residents are better off because those that own homes, their home values have increased and there's less poverty. And the children of original residents are more likely to attend and finish college. So it's a positive effect of gentrification on the children of the existing residents. Okay, so what is happening here with gentrification? Like, why are we not finding displacement? Well, some of this is the rents are not increasing at dramatic rates for the existing residents. They're in old buildings. There's some limits on how much rent can go up. And so they're not really being pushed out by those higher rental rates. Also, their incomes are going up. They have more opportunity because this neighborhood has an influx of high income individuals. So, that nice store needs to hire people. Or, they make connections with the high income people and they're able to get better jobs. So even though the rent goes up, their income goes up as well. And typically how turnover works in a gentrifying neighborhood, it's not about who moves out. It's about who moves in. So any neighborhood is going to have natural turnover. People are going to die, and those houses are going to be opened up. With gentrification, those houses are bought by high-income individuals rather than low-income individuals. Or people just move naturally. Low-income individuals typically move a lot. And so there's just a natural amount of moves. And so when someone moves out, someone has to move in. And with gentrification, again, the person who moves in is going to be middle to high income. So it's not really about who moves out. We're not really seeing that more people are being pushed out. Rather, just a high income households are moving in. Also, a lot of the housing that is created in a gentrifying neighborhood is additive. So it's not like I'm taking away like an apartment and replacing it with a luxury apartment. There's some of that, but traditionally what happens is, when you think about my neighborhood, over here, there's a new apartment complex going in, 4 stories, brand new apartment complex. What did it displace? Well, what was there before was a local market. So the local market's gone, so that's not like we're losing housing stock. We're just gaining a bunch of housing stock. And the bottom floor would be another type of market. So we're actually not losing anything in terms of space. It's being added above it. In other parts of the neighborhood, apartment complexes are being demolished, but typically these are 8-unit apartment complexes that are being demolished, and then 40 units are being put in. So again, we're adding to the stock. Oftentimes, you'll even have old buildings, like the Sears factory on the east side, is being repurposed for residential housing. So what gentrification often looks like is not like we are taking away an apartment and building a nicer apartment. We're taking away 2 old apartments and building 18 new, nicer apartments. Or we're building on an empty lot, or we're building on a warehouse, or we're building on like a rundown mini mall. And so, we're actually adding to the housing stock. And again, this will, not lead to displacement. If you're just adding housing units, you're not necessarily displacing people. Now, that's not to say displacement doesn't exist. Of course, you can find examples of people who had to leave a neighborhood because the rental prices increased. What the totality of the research is suggesting is that this effect, this mobility effect of people being pushed out, is not any higher in gentrifying neighborhoods than non-gentrifying neighborhoods. Also, this is not to say that this is true in every case. We may be able to find neighborhoods where it is true. It's just in the literature, that has not been the case up to this point. Maybe with better data, maybe with new statistical techniques, they will find displacement. But the state of the research at present is they have found very little evidence of displacement. So why do people hate gentrification so much? I think, well, one is there's this myth of displacement. They see it as displacement. And I do think that people generally don't like it when things change, particularly neighborhoods. People don't like it when the place they grew up looks different. You hold on to where you hold on to your childhood experiences. You hold on to, what your high school experience was. Like when I go back to my hometown, I don't like it to look different. I want it to look like exactly what it looked like when I was in high school, where I have all the good memories of. I wish I looked like what I did. Actually, no, I don't wish I looked like what I looked like in high school. But in general, people prefer things to stay the same. So I think there's just a bit of animosity towards change, a reticence against change. There is some displacement, but again, it's not more than in non-gentrifying neighborhoods. And then there's like cultural and racial reasons why people probably don't like gentrification that again are beyond the scope of the class. We're focusing on just the economic process, just the displacement. All right. Okay, let's take a break and then we'll come back with part 2 of the lecture.